Conclusion. After Dominion. 9 miles from my home as the blackbird flies, on the site of what is now City Hall Plaza in Boston, once stood the offices of the abolitionist newspaper The Liberator. It was here, from its perch overlooking the bustling cobblestone street of Cornhill, that William Lloyd Garrison and the free black journalists who wrote for the paper hurled thunderbolts of rage and invective against the evils of slavery, and against those who profited by, or merely excused, the slave system. Funds for the newspaper had been raised by a committee of black women led by Bathsheba Fowler and Elizabeth Riley, and the paper was sustained in its early years by black Bostonians and other black Americans in the Northeast. As late as 1829, Garrison, a white journalist raised in Newburyport, Massachusetts, had sided with the reformist wing of the abolitionist cause, which called for a gradualist approach to eliminating slavery. 2 years later, however, he had changed his mind. In his inaugural address in The Liberator in January 1831, Garrison now denounced the pernicious doctrine of gradual abolition, asking pardon of my God, of my country, and of my brethren the poor slaves, for having uttered a sentiment so full of timidity, injustice, and absurdity. Boston had been home to anti-slavery sentiment at least since the Revolution, when Prince Hall, a black Bostonian and former slave, had agitated for the equal treatment of blacks within the Continental Army. Garrison now framed abolitionism as a continuation of the same struggle for liberty as the Revolution, invoking the pitched battle between rebellious colonists and the British Army at Bunker Hill, 50 years before. For the next 30 years, The Liberator would be the most widely circulated abolitionist newspaper in the nation. So radical was the paper in its denunciation of the slave system that the slave-owning state of Georgia put a $5,000 bounty on Garrison's head, the equivalent to $150,000 today. Only with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation did the Liberator shut down. No one in 1831 could have imagined that Garrison's anti-gradualist stance, so uncompromising that even Frederick Douglass at times found it extreme, would one day become the common sense of the nation. Yet it did. Today, few would hold that slavery should have been reformed rather than abolished, or that its evils should have been tolerated a moment longer than they were. In hindsight, we agree that the problem with slavery wasn't its excesses, the abuses inflicted by the cruelest of slave owners, but the slave system itself. Today, a new abolitionist movement has taken shape. Like the abolitionists of old, who broke with the anti-slavery moderates who sought only a gradual phasing out of slavery over time, the new abolitionists view as misguided the efforts of animal gradualists or welfarists to ameliorate only the excesses of the system. From this new abolitionist viewpoint, animal agriculture, fishing, whaling, fur ranching, genetic engineering of animals, bullfights, and so on, are but symptoms of the same corrupt structure, the same total system of exploitation and violence, where the animal welfarist seeks only better modes of confinement for hens, more humane gas chambers for pigs, or more sustainable forms of killing marine life. The abolitionist seeks an end to the violent relation of domination itself. Will future generations one day look upon our treatment of animals today with the same degree of moral revulsion that we now feel gazing back at the horrors of slavery? Will they wonder, too, at our own apathy and indifference in the face of so plain and pervasive an evil? If we have learned nothing else from 12,000 years of animal agriculture, it is that we cannot exploit and kill other sensitive beings ethically or kindly. The idea of a humane omnivorism is as old as the hills. The Jewish injunction against Tsar Bali Chaim, causing suffering of living creatures, dates back nearly 3,000 years. Yet kosher guidelines for ethical slaughter were nowhere in evidence in 2004 at the agriprocessors plant in Iowa, the nation's largest kosher slaughterhouse, when an undercover investigation revealed cows being shocked in their sensitive faces with electric prods, having their tracheas and esophagi ripped from their throats with meat hooks or knives, while conscious, and writhing in pools of their own blood, trying desperately to stand up for up to 3 minutes as blood poured from their throats. More than 1,000 years have passed, too, since the Islamic scholars of the Brethren of Purity condemned human brutality towards animals in the case of the animals versus man. Yet animals are still subjected to unspeakable cruelties throughout the Middle East, and there are few laws in Muslim societies protecting animals from even extreme abuse. Secular appeals to mitigate the cruel use of exploited animals have meanwhile fared no better. In 1641, when the authorities of the Massachusetts Bay Colony published the Body of Liberties, the first Bill of Rights published in the New World, they extended protections to domesticated animals, too. No man, the bill proclaimed, shall exercise any tyranny or cruelty towards any brute creature which are usually kept for man's use. 4 centuries later, however, tyranny and cruelty towards animals here in my native state are as pervasive as ever. It is no longer considered acceptable to beat a horse to death in the streets of Boston. But even worse acts of cruelty are inflicted every day in private, outside the public's gaze, in rural slaughterhouses, and in government-funded laboratories at Harvard and MIT. At the end of the day, the problem is that animals don't consent to being used and brutalized by us. So long, then, as we choose to exploit and impose our will on them, it will always be necessary for us to wield violent force against them. Critics who persist in clinging to the fantasy of painless animal agriculture, fishing, and other exploitative practices are therefore deceiving themselves as much as their publics. The spurious distinctions they draw between ethical and unethical forms of animal exploitation, between necessary and unnecessary violence and suffering, will forever remain distinctions without a difference. In Henrik Ibsen's play An Enemy of the People, a physician named Dr. Stockman discovers that the supposed healing waters of his town's new spas, about to open to the public, are in reality dangerous, having been poisoned by a tannery upstream. When Stockman informs the town's leadership of his shocking discovery, he expects them to shut down the spas and to thank him for having narrowly averted both a public health disaster and the town's reputational ruin. Instead, the town's citizens reject Dr. Stockman's findings and try to drive him and his family out of town. A mob attacks the Stockman's home, shattering its windows with stones. Whenever I hear vegans and animal advocates mocked as idealists or utopians, or even denounced as threats to civilization, I think of Ibsen's play. We see a similar story playing out in public debates over meat today. As the informed few try to warn the public of the ecological, health, and ethical calamities of the animal system, only to be shouted down by the meat-eating majority. Apologists for the animal economy have assumed the tragicomic role of a Slackson, the cautious town printer who urges moderation throughout the play, yet who sides with the angry mob against the Stockmans, in warning the public against the stridency and immoderacy of vegans. In response to such critics, no more apposite reply could be offered than William Lloyd Garrison's rebuttal to the gradualists of his own day, in the inaugural issue of The Liberator. I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. No, no. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. Though Garrison's critics did what they could to silence him, their efforts proved fruitless. It is likewise in vain that meat apologists hope for the abolitionists of today to moderate their demands, or to retreat from their convictions. Slave apologists who denounced abolitionists as dangerous utopians warned that any effort to overthrow so ancient and venerable an institution would lead to social chaos and economic collapse. And they were not wholly wrong. 600,000 Americans lost their lives in a brutal civil war, and the dissolution of the Atlantic slave trade brought wrenching upheavals to the economy and culture of the nation. Slave auctioneers no longer had enslaved people to auction. Printers of handbills advertising rewards for runaway slaves lost business. Sailors employed on slave ships had to seek work on other vessels. Blacksmiths no longer produced leg irons for human chattel, though they continued to make irons for black laborers impressed through the 13th Amendment. Yet abolishing slavery was unquestionably the right thing to do, and the overthrow of the old world made possible the invention of a new, superior world. Black Americans seized upon their changed condition to create flourishing black communities and new forms of culture and experience. Their subsequent contributions to science, art, literature, music, and every other domain of human culture are incalculable. It would take another century of struggle for freed African Americans to secure true voting rights. And even today, the ugly legacy of slavery lingers on in continuing patterns of economic inequality, struggles over racist gerrymandering, disproportionate rates of incarceration for people of color, and mass shootings of blacks by white supremacists. Abolition remains an ongoing project. Nonetheless, the abolition of de jure slavery vastly extended the rights of blacks and expanded our existential possibilities as a species. Were we in our own epoch to end our enslavement of our fellow creatures, we would likewise put an end to one world while engendering a new, superior one. And we would not lament the passing of the old order as much as we think. It was not long ago that whaling and horse-drawn carriages were viewed as being as vital to the nation's economy and cultural identity, as ranching and lobstering are to the Texan and New Englander today. Yet no one misses these earlier brutal practices or even notices their absence. Change is therefore possible. Today, plant-based milks are competing with cow's milk at the supermarket. Ringling Brothers has retired elephants from its circus acts. Greyhound racing has been all but eliminated in the U.S. Similar efforts to end horse racing are gaining momentum in the wake of the deaths of numerous horses at race tracks. In 2019, the California State Assembly passed a law banning fur products in the state. Macy's followed suit the next year, announcing that it was ending all fur sales in its department stores. In 2023, the Food and Drug Administration ended its long-standing requirement that drugs be tested first on non-human animals, admitting for the first time that cell-based assays, microphysiological systems, or bioprinted or computer models are just as effective. None of these developments, all achieved through the courageous, persistent efforts of animal advocates, have imperiled significant human interests. After passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, compelling free states to return those who had escaped their bondage to their owners, organized resistance to federal enforcement of the act sprang up in northern states. Here in Massachusetts, the Boston Vigilance Committee and a secret group called the Anti-Manhunting League worked to shelter fugitives. In 1851, an escaped slave named Shadrach Minkins was liberated from a Boston courthouse and safely conveyed to Canada, one of many enslaved persons aided by black and white abolitionist activists in Boston. Today we find organized resistance growing against the animal system. 2. Open rescues, in which activists liberate animals being held in miserable forced confinement, are forcing the courts to reckon with the illegality of interspecies compassion. In 2017, several activists videotaped themselves rescuing 2 maimed and dying piglets who had been discarded in a dead pile on a Utah farm supplying pigs to Smithfield Foods. Though Smithfield claimed the commercial value of the discarded piglets to be only $84.40, the FBI assigned multiple agents to investigate the case, pursuing burglary and theft charges against the activists. At the trial in 2022, The pro-industry judge prohibited the defendants from introducing any expert testimony concerning animal sentience and welfare, or the suffering of the dying animals. He also prohibited introduction of the necessity defense, which excuses a criminal act committed to prevent an immediate, more serious harm from occurring. Nonetheless, the jury acquitted the activists of all charges against them, a turn of events that stunned all concerned. It was one of the most significant legal setbacks of the animal industry ever. Isolated legal victories and piecemeal reforms alone, however, won't end the animal economy. The broader structure of violence and ecological desolation described in this work will endure so long as we continue to view non-human animals as our slaves and commodities. In the meantime, companies like Smithfield will continue to kill billions of animals, and they will do so not only with the official sanction of the state, but with the tacit consent of a public for whom the pleasures of bacon outweigh any nominal concern for animal welfare. In the summer of 2023, torrential rains in Vermont led to calamitous flash floods that left the state's major cities underwater, briefly cutting the state capital of Montpelier off from the outside world. The flooding, the worst in the state's history, was another ominous reminder, in a summer of frightening natural disasters across the globe, of the expanding threat of global warming. The floods also served as an ironic, if unremarked, counterpoint to the state's own thriving dairy and meat industries, whose climate-changing emissions had contributed in some small way to the disaster. Even as Vermont officials were providing emergency funding to help animal farmers recover from the flooding, however, a determined community of animal advocates in Windsor County was quietly charting a different course, beyond dominion and outside the commodity logics of the capitalist system. The summer before the floods, I accompanied the animal ethicist Zipporah Weisberg on a research trip to Vermont to visit Vine Animal Sanctuary, located in the small town of Springfield. After leaving the highway, we drove through gentle hillsides, pine forests, and sprawling farmland before finally arriving at a large house shaded by a towering oak, where we were welcomed by Vine's director and co-founder, Patrice Jones, an unassuming queer woman in her early 60s, with close-cropped gray hair and glasses. Patrice, she prefers the lowercase, like the poet E. Cummings, would spend the next 2 days showing us around and explaining Vine's unique philosophy. A feminist and former tenant organizer, Patrice had originally run a small animal sanctuary in Maryland with activist Miriam Jones, then her partner. Later, the women relocated the animals to Vermont and expanded their operation. It was Patrice and Miriam who had opposed Green Mountain College's plan to kill Bill and Lou, the draft oxen, and who had offered to adopt the animals. Today, there are over 500 residents at the sanctuary, including chickens, alpacas, pheasants, ducks, pigs, and other vulnerable selves, cared for by a paid staff and a small network of volunteers. At first glance, Vine has the appearance of an ordinary working farm, with much of the traditional farm work of feeding and providing water for the animals, patching fences, and shoveling chicken waste. Unlike on a working farm, however, none of the animals on Vine are there to produce or to be slaughtered for humans. Instead, Vine is a haven for animals rescued or escaped from the animal industrial complex, chickens saved from factory farms and misguided school egg hatching projects, pigeons saved from canned hunts, cows rescued from the butcher. The sanctuary is consciously organized around LGBTQ, feminist, and ecological principles. Among other things, this means that the animals aren't condescended to, but treated as co-equals within the community. The sanctuary's governing principle of nonviolent ecological community is meanwhile extended as well to the adjacent woodlands and fields. Unlike traditional farms and ranches, Vine doesn't treat neighboring animals as pests to be exterminated. Here there are no traps or poisons, not even for the rats who pilfer the seeds and corn set out for the chickens each morning. After welcoming us, Patrice left us in the hands of Rachel, a Vermont native in her 40s who cares for the chickens. Rachel told us that when she first started working at Vine, she had seen farmed animals the way others did, as food, having grown up eating meat and dairy like other Vermonters. Over time, though, she began to see them differently. Everything changed in the first week or so, she said, watching the birds, watching the mammals, watching everybody. Just the way they interacted with one another, the way they interacted with us. I was like, what am I doing? Before, she had thought of chickens as all alike. Now she began to see them as unique individuals. Rachel told us about a hen named C who had been rescued from an egg-laying operation. Another hen from the same facility had arrived at Vine at the same time, and the two birds had remained close companions. When C passed away, Rachel recounted, her friend mourned her. She kept on going to the corner where she would always snuggle up in the shavings or the straw, just sit there and make this noise that I'd never heard before. And I've heard many noises come out of these birds. It was like she was crying. It was so sad. You have some birds that grow a bond with each other and love one another, and then you have some that are just like. It's like people. Today, Rachel no longer eats meat or other products from animals. I was completely wrong, she told us. I was misled. Like other staffers we went on to meet, Rachel refers to the non-human residents at Vine as persons. The practice arose informally, out of simple recognition that each animal is an individual with complex needs that are both species-specific and highly personal. Animals whose trauma history or temperament make them wary of touch and connection are given a respectfully wide berth. When other animals actively seek out hugs or caresses from the staff, however, the humans are happy to reciprocate their affections, chores permitting. The animals are generally not segregated by species, but allowed to associate freely with the other animals, and interspecies friendships are common. On the day of our visit, we were on hand for the rare introduction of a new someone to the sanctuary, a cow named Pupil who'd lost her home after the woman who'd kept her as a pet died. Standing outside the barn at the top of the lower pasture, we heard the low rumble of the cattle transport truck, straining up the steep dirt road leading to the main property. Even before the truck had come into sight, the other animals had streamed out of the barn to see who was arriving, either because they knew that the transport only brought cows to the sanctuary, or simply keen to be in on whatever was happening. The cows rather impolitely shoved aside the smaller animals in their haste to greet the newcomer. After the driver had backed his rig up to the barn, he and Cheryl Wiley, Vine's director of animal care, gently coaxed Pupil down the truck's ramp, as the other animals looked on with avid interest. Once on her own, Pupil began exploring her new surroundings, first tentatively, then with quiet curiosity, accompanied or perhaps pestered by a young male cow who had taken an immediate shine to her. The two explored the pasture contentedly together. While Vine is utopian in its aspirations, it is not a utopia and doesn't claim to be. Like persons everywhere, the inhabitants of Vine bring plenty of drama to their relationships, and there are occasional squabbles and misunderstandings. The staff must also make compromises in order to ensure the safety and well-being of their residents. While the animals are given as much liberty and autonomy as possible, staff rely on physical barriers and chicken coops to protect the vulnerable from outside predators, and to keep the cows from straying onto their neighbors' private property. Vaccines and other veterinary procedures are also a necessity. Inevitably, Vine staff must also sometimes make the painful decision to euthanize someone in the last stages of a terminal disease or following a catastrophic accident. In such cases, however, death is meted out not to save resources, nor to reduce aggregate suffering, but as a mercy to a beloved individual, and then only reluctantly and as a last resort. Every loss is personally grieved, as the loss of an individual. Many people fear that a world without meat, dairy, eggs, and fish would be one without pleasure, perhaps even without purpose. Yet the visitor to Vine would be hard-pressed to say what is missing from the rich, purposeful lives of the staff there. Vine is a struggling nonprofit, and its personnel are underpaid. Yet even staff who have been on site for many years remain excited about their work. We found them eager to share their experiences with us. And because everything the staff does is grounded in a genuine ethos of care, rather than in the illusion of care, the work at Vine has an existential and moral authenticity that one never encounters on a working animal farm. For here there is no violence, and hence no betrayal. We have come to view our relations with other animals as a zero-sum game, fearing that to promote their interests is to threaten or diminish ours. But Vine and similar experiments show us what we ourselves stand to gain in addressing other beings as thous rather than as its, as persons rather than things. Standing outside the barn that afternoon at Vine, watching the goats lazing about in the shade to escape the summer heat, the guinea fowl chasing one another through the tall grass, the cows nudging the staff for neck rubs, we felt we had caught a glimpse of the peaceable kingdom, the lineaments not of some mythic Eden, still less of a fraudulent past golden era of animal agriculture, but of a more advanced civilization, a future society which, having chosen to bury its whips, prods, and chains, to dismantle its slaughterhouses and to recall its trawlers, had won for itself the higher spiritual goods of compassion, mercy, and love.